Jeremy, it's great to be here to speak with you. Congratulations on your new role at
Thanks
Refugees
so much.
International.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to talk to you about it.
So you've had quite a long career working in the humanitarian arena, working with displaced persons. You've been in some of the most challenging parts of the world during real crises. What originally drew you to this work? What keeps you going?
3 days after I graduated from college, I got on a plane and went to Albania to work on the Kosovo refugee crisis. And from that moment, I've really been hooked. And I think two things hooked me and two things have sustained me in this. One is the mission. It's such a compelling mission to do this work, to support and help the most vulnerable people on the planet, and to help them to realize their potential. And I think that we as RI try to frame this as empowering those who are affected by crisis, not putting ourselves at the center of the story, putting them at the center of the story. And that's something that I've always found in my career, and something that has drawn me to RI. I think the other thing that really sustains me is the people and is the relationships that you make in this work. Some of the most interesting, most ethical, most compelling people you'll ever meet are doing this work or are in the communities that we're serving, and so it's the people and the relationships and the mission that I think have drawn me to this and sustain it.
You come here, of course, from USAID, overseeing a massive effort there with regard to COVID, the pandemic. Samantha Power called you, and I'm quoting, an instrumental force in U.S. efforts to vaccinate the world. I mean, this had to be, and we hope it's just a once-in-a-lifetime thing for all of us. But what would you say are the lessons you learned from that experience?
One of the really key lessons of the pandemic, and particularly of the work that we did on vaccinating the world, is the importance of starting with the voices of the people you're trying to help. A lot of what went wrong initially with global vaccine access was a failure to listen to and a failure to equip the people who are on the front lines. What we saw was rich countries understandably met their own vaccine needs first before they began sharing with others. And when South Africa began producing vaccines, they very rapidly began sharing with the rest of the continent. I think there's a key lesson there about building the capacities to help and building access to resources, building access to assistance closer to the populations that need it. And I think there's a very parallel issue at play in the humanitarian system. So much of the financing for the system and so much of the ownership of the system resides in big global institutions that are pretty distant from the people they're serving. And I think what we need to do is devolve a lot of that. The more we can devolve power, the more we can devolve voice, the more we can devolve resources closer to the populations we're trying to help, the more effective that will be. And I think we saw that, with vaccine production and financing, and we see that with humanitarian assistance.
The challenge you face with this organization seems to be overwhelming. We are, at a moment when we not only see conflict still raging in parts of the world. Climate change is something that we're now more aware of than ever. People are being displaced, as we say, not just by conflict, but now by how we see climate changing. How do you look at the need to get your priorities right in this? How do you decide what most to focus on when it comes to you've got to think about the whole world. How do you see that?
I think to start at a really macro level, these are big challenges. They're not necessarily unprecedented or unmanageable. And I think it's important as we talk about these challenges to say, yes, they are staggering, but they're not impossible to address. And there is a way to do this. There is a way to help people at scale if we have the political will to do so. And I think the importance of an organization like RI, as an organization that focuses on that policy level, is to point the way, to show the art of the possible on managing these challenges. It can feel paralyzing when all you see is crisis and you don't see a way to address it. And I think if we look at history, if you look at the post-World War II era, if you look at how the U.S. managed the arrival of Vietnamese boat people in the 70s, which was one of the things that created, kind of spawned Refugees International and a lot of other aid organizations, what we find are these instances of huge crises that frankly are as large as anything we're seeing today, but there was the political will to manage them. And I think what we've lost in recent years is some of that political will. And so I think as I look to the future for RI, we want to focus on those discrete crises, but I think the more macro issue is we also need globally to rebuild some of that political will to manage crises in a humane way.
One of the things that's becoming clearer as time goes by is that the displaced people themselves are not part of the decision making, that it's made at a very high level. These decisions, big decisions made at a high level, they're not part of the conversation.
That's right.
How do you, as the incoming boss at Refugees International, see, how that should change?
Yeah, that's been a problem in the humanitarian architecture for many years, that we have an amazing global system for providing assistance and providing and advancing protection, but it tends to be driven by a more a supply-centric mentality. So you have these big, incredibly capable but very big multilateral agencies that drive the discussion, drive the dialogue, and it can be hard for the voices of affected people to break through. And I think one of the real lessons is we need to do much more to put affected people at the center of how we make decisions. And so RI is trying to lead by example on that. We have always found, and frankly we've researched to back this up, that refugees and displaced people are the most compelling advocates for their own need. And we have a system that doesn't put them at the center of that right now. And so we need to work towards changing that system, and RI is going to lead by example in that, and is doing that in centering refugee voices in our own advocacy.
One of the things that RI has tried to be vocal about and raise the visibility of is the intersection between climate change and migration. We know this is something the Biden administration is looking at. How do you see opportunity to influence the thinking of official U.S. policy on this?
So I think a few things are important on climate migration. One is this is not a future problem, it's a now problem. And in fact, it's a problem that's been with us for a while. If you look back to crises like the Darfur crisis, the Syria crisis, the crises in the Horn, all of these have a climate component to them. The change in climate patterns, the change in food patterns drives and exacerbates crisis, and that in turn drives migration. We have had 3 historic level droughts in the Horn of Africa since 2011. We're in the midst of the worst of them right now. And we're going to continue to see that, and it's likely to accelerate. And so I think what policymakers need to do is think ahead to how we're going to manage these problems. Having a sort of ad hoc, reactive, disordered response to rising levels of climate migration is going to be bad from just a policy and a technical perspective, but also quite bad from a political perspective, because we've seen in the last 10 years a real tie between the rise of extremist politics and negative reactions to asylum and to flows of people seeking refuge. If we see those flows grow and we can't get better and more intentional about managing it, I think the political impacts of that are going to be quite dire as well. So I think there's a need to reframe both the policy, but also to reframe the politics to say this doesn't have to be a zero-sum thing. These are manageable problems. And ultimately, if we look back to history, if we look back to that post-World War II era, if we look back to the ways we handled migration from out of Vietnam in the wake of the Vietnam War, and even what's happening right now with Ukrainians in Europe, these are manageable situations if we choose to manage them. And that is also how you blunt some of the more extremist political reactions.
I'm sure it caught a lot of attention when you said in the announcement about your new role, and I'm quoting here, that politicians on all sides have treated people fleeing crisis as if they are the crisis, and treated as a problem to be managed rather than human beings. Expand on that. I mean, what are you speaking about there, and how do you even begin to change that?
We have this tendency to always talk about every crisis as if it is big and unprecedented and something that we can't manage. I think, yeah, there are many big crises. Some of them are unprecedented, but we can actually manage a lot of them if we choose to. So talking about people seeking refuge as if it's a flood or if it's a deluge, that I think plays into some of the more negative political reactions, and it creates a context in which all politicians look at this as a problem and then are kind of scrapping over how humanely we will deal with the problem or who will manage that problem more effectively, as opposed to looking at this as it doesn't have to be a zero-sum issue. It is not a harm to the United States or to other countries when people seek refuge and are brought into the U.S. My former colleague Michael Clemens from the Center for Global Development has written extensively about it's actually a net value add economically when we take refugees into this country. They turn into net economic contributors within a few years. That mentality has not been infused into our politics, and I think what we tend to see is the left and right arguing over the finer points of how do we. They kind of accept the premise that this is a problem, and then argue over how humanely or how effectively do we manage it. I think we need to reframe that to say this is not a problem. It's a challenge. It's a challenge we can manage, and it's also an opportunity to strengthen and help the country. And a lot of throughout our history, I think there is a deep sense within the DNA of America that part of what we do and part of why we exist is to protect and support people seeking refuge, and that the strength of this country comes from that.
There's so many crises that you could, at any given moment, be worried about, thinking about. But right now, as you begin to take on this new position, what keeps you up at night?
Beyond any individual crisis, and there are plenty of problems in any of those individual crises, but I think the more macro issue that I worry about is I think we face this nexus of rising political extremism, often in reaction to people seeking asylum, and the fact that over the next 10 or 20 years, with climate change accelerating, we're likely to see more and more of that. And if we don't get out ahead of that, it could be obviously very bad for individuals. It could be very bad in terms of just the kind of the policy challenge. But more fundamentally, it could drive some really toxic politics. And whether that's the rise of political extremism in countries in Europe, some of the challenges we've seen in this country, I think there's a real kind of impulse by some of those more extreme voices to cast this as a disordered situation, an unmanageable situation, a crisis. And I think we need to be much more forceful in saying it doesn't have to be that. If we let it be that, if we accept that framing of the issue, then I think we are in for a very rough ride over the next 20 years, not just in terms of the human impact of the migration, but also the wider impact that could have on our politics.
I want to circle back to what we spoke about at the beginning. You've worked in government, you worked in think tanks, you've worked in the humanitarian arena. What, at this point in your career, what do you think drew you to want to be part of this advocacy organization, specifically RI?
I've gone back and forth between operational response and advocacy. I started my career in the field, working first in the Balkans and then later working in a number of countries in Africa. And what you find when you're working at that level is that some of the problems that you keep running into can't be solved at that level. They are policy problems, and you need to go up to a more macro level to try and resolve those. And so when I first came back to Washington from the field, it was driven by that recognition that the things that were frustrating me were not going to be solved by where I was working. They needed to be solved at an advocacy level and at a policy level. And I think what I found in government as well is, when you're in government, you have certain guardrails on what you can do. There is a sort of there's an Overton window of how much you can affect policy or make the decisions that you can make that is set by some of those political parameters, but it's hard to move those political parameters when you're on the inside. I think the value and the power of an organization like RI is that we can try and shift that window. And we need a good inside-outside game working with our counterparts in the government, where they have the ability to make the change we want to see, but also to shift the political landscape that they're operating within, so that they too can move more in the direction that we want to see. And I think that's a hard thing to do when you're inside government.
Jeremy Konyndyk, taking over as the president of Refugees International RI. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
It's great to have this conversation.
Likewise, it's a pleasure. Thank you.